Throughout your life, you grew up hearing a silent promise that wars in Europe were a thing of the past, that tanks crossing borders were something out of history books. But that promise is over. And it didn't end all at once with a bang. It ended gradually. A cable cut at the bottom of the sea here, a drone lost over there, a factory catching fire in the middle of the night. Until one day, the entire continent realized the same thing at the same time. Russia didn't leave, it just changed its tactics. And Europe, which spent 30 years dismantling its own armies, woke up. From the frozen borderlands of the Baltic states to the industrial heart of Germany, the biggest arms race the continent has seen since the Cold War is happening. 700 kilometers of concrete walls rising from the ground. The German giant that once trained with broomsticks is now buying missiles capable of reaching Moscow. And an alliance that everyone thought was dead, proving on the Baltic ice that it still knows how to act as one. In the next few minutes, you will understand this turnaround in 4 chapters. First, the most tense border on the planet and the kind of invisible war that's being fought there. Then, how even a former superpower was caught off guard. Next, the awakening of Europe's sleeping giant. And finally, proof that the West, when it decides to, still bites. And the question that connects all of this is this: will Europe be able to shield itself in time? Let's start answering this question exactly where the danger is most real, at the border with Russia. Right on the border with Russia, something huge is coming out of the ground. Rows and rows of concrete pyramids embedded in the ground, as far as the eye can see. Ditches deep enough to swallow an entire tank. Minefields, sensors hidden in the woods. That's 700 kilometers of this, crossing 3 countries. It's the largest defense project Europe has built since the Cold War. And nobody builds something like this on a whim. Nobody buries 700 kilometers of concrete on their own border unless they're really afraid of what might come from the other side. Then comes the question: waiting for what? Because this is when things get weird. For 4 years, Russia has been trying and trying, but hasn't been able to take Ukraine. 4 years. So, explain something to me. Why is it that right now, Latvia, Estonia, and Lithuania, the 3 Baltic countries right next to Russia, are digging trenches with the urgency of someone expecting enemy tanks tomorrow morning? What are they noticing that we aren't? The answer to that question? Well, it says a lot more about the kind of danger that Russia has become. And when you understand what's really happening at this border, you'll look at this concrete wall in a completely different way. Let's begin by taking a hard look at the actual state of this war. Because there's a huge difference between what Russia promised to be and what it became. When Russian tanks crossed the Ukrainian border back in 2022, the plan was to take the capital Kyiv in just a few days. It was supposed to be quick. It was supposed to be easy. It was supposed to show the world the power of the second largest army on the planet. 4 years later, that army is bogged down. Ukraine not only held on, but this year it started retaking territory again. At the beginning of the year, for the first time since 2023, the Ukrainians gained more territory than they lost in an entire month. Russia is losing about 1,000 men per day, and they ran so short on armored vehicles that the victory parade in Moscow, which is meant to showcase all their military might, went by this year with almost no tanks on the avenue. For an army that promised to swallow Ukraine in a week, that says a lot. Now, keep this image in your mind for now. Because it's here that almost everyone jumps to the easy conclusion. Most people think, if Russia can barely make any progress in Ukraine, then it can't really be a serious threat anymore. And that's exactly where the mistake lies. Does a bogged-down army give up? Yes. An army might give up. But a regime that has staked everything on a war, no. Think about the situation Vladimir Putin got himself into. He turned this war into the very reason for his government's existence. He made the entire economy revolve around it. He sent hundreds of thousands of men to their deaths. A leader in that position can't just address his own country and say, "Look everyone, it was all in vain. I thought it was better to stop." Stopping for him is more dangerous than continuing. So if the front door is closed, if breaking in by force doesn't work anymore, what's left? That leaves the back door. And this is where things get more dangerous, because a cornered enemy doesn't become harmless. He becomes more unpredictable. The truth is that the enemy who still has a lot to lose, well, that one thinks twice. But the enemy who feels like they're losing everything starts doing things they wouldn't have done before. The tight spot Russia got itself into hasn't taken the danger off the table. It just changed the form of that danger. It swapped the tank coming from the front for something much harder to see, and much harder to fight. And do you know what this backdoor is in practice? Well, let me tell you a story that really happened at the bottom of the Baltic Sea. On Christmas Eve, an old oil tanker, one of those that nobody really knows who owns, was crossing the Baltic Sea. Underneath it, at the bottom of the sea, there was a power cable that connects Finland to Estonia. And as it sailed, this ship was dragging its anchor along the ocean floor. Not just for a few meters, for more than 10 kilometers. The anchor tore up the seabed like a knife and cut the power cable. And it wasn't just that one. It cut communication cables too. Finland seized the ship. And then came the most revealing part of the whole story. That ship was part of a secret Russian fleet. The famous Shadow Fleet. A bunch of old oil tankers with no clear owner on paper that the country uses for two dirty jobs. One is to dodge sanctions and sell oil secretly. And the other, we're finding out now, to cause damage on the seabed. But when the case went to court, the tribunal released the crew. They couldn't prove it was on purpose. That's exactly where the danger is. Look, the damage is real. The cable was cut, the power was cut. The loss was real, but what about the blame? Whose fault is it? It's practically impossible to say. Was it sabotage, or was it just a poorly secured anchor? You can never prove it. And it wasn't an isolated case. There were at least 11. Incidents like this in the Baltic, cables cut one after another, always in the same way, always impossible to prove. This is war. But it's a war designed to never look like war. And there's a very specific reason why it's designed that way. So, there's a line that Russia cannot cross. And that line has a name, Article 5. You probably already know the rule. An attack on one NATO country is an attack on all at once. So, if Russia invades Estonia with tanks, it's not just facing Estonia. It's facing the United States, Germany, France, the whole world at once. It's the kind of war nobody wants to start. So, Russia does the math. Invading openly, with tanks, triggers Article 5 and brings the whole world against it. But cutting a cable at the bottom of the sea? Launching a drone that got lost along the way? Or pushing crowds of immigrants to the border on purpose to overwhelm the neighboring country? None of that is clear enough to trigger the rule. It's damage without a signature. It's war that stays below the line. And if you think cutting cables and launching drones is already a low blow, just wait, it gets worse. Because the most calculated blow of all didn't come from the bottom of the sea. It came signed in ink on official paper. In May of this year, Putin signed a new law. And this law deserves all your attention. Because it is the most dangerous piece on this whole board. The law authorizes Russia to use military force to protect Russian citizens abroad. Russians who are imprisoned, prosecuted, or persecuted by courts in other countries. It sounds bureaucratic, I know, but pay attention to what this really means. There are about 40,000 Russian citizens in Latvia and more than 80,000 in Estonia. According to the new law, if any of them are arrested or prosecuted, even if it's completely justified, Russia claims the right to send troops to protect that person. You just saw an excuse for invasion being manufactured right in front of you. And it's not a theory. It's exactly the same justification that Russia used to invade Georgia in 2008. It's the same justification it used to take Crimea from Ukraine in 2014. We're just protecting our own. That excuse has already worked twice, and now Putin has turned it into law. He left it sitting in a drawer, waiting for the day it would be convenient to use it. So let's go. Put the pieces together, because this is where the whole plan shows up. Look at each thing on its own. A drone that crashes is an incident. A cut cable is an accident. A new law is just words on paper. Each one alone seems like a small thing. Easy to ignore. But all three together on the same border in the same year? That's not bad luck. That's a plan. And the secret of the plan is this. Each piece pushes the boundary. Just a little bit. None of them, by themselves, are big enough to start a war. Now tell me, if you were Latvia, Estonia, or Lithuania, small countries with Russia right on your border, would you just sit back and wait to see which one of them will be the last straw? Of course not. And now that concrete wall from the beginning of the video finally makes sense. Those concrete pyramids I showed you at the beginning are not decoration. They are the answer. There are 3 rows of concrete, so close together that no tank, no armored vehicle can get through the middle. Behind them, trenches to stop tanks. Minefields, 700 kilometers of this, connecting the Baltic countries to Poland. It's the largest line of fortification that Europe has built since the Cold War, and the plan is to finish everything by 2028. But there's an important detail here. Many people think that this is just another stationary wall, like those used in World War II, and that the Germans simply went around. The Baltic line is different from that. It's a carefully designed trap. The concrete doesn't exist to stop the enemy by itself. It exists to force the tanks that advance in a line to do one thing: move off a straight path, to swerve, to slow down, to squeeze through a narrow passage. And this passage leads straight into the line of fire. Behind the wall, long-range rocket launchers are waiting, which can hit targets up to 300 kilometers away. In other words, the concrete doesn't stop the tank. The concrete hands the tank over. But the concrete wall is only half the answer because concrete doesn't shoot by itself, and that's where the West's strongest move comes in. Look! At the same time that the concrete goes up at the border, NATO is moving people. A lot of people. There are entire army corps that used to be in a city in Germany called Münster. This corps is being relocated to take over military command of Estonia and Latvia later this year. And a corps is not a small detail. It's a command structure capable of leading about 50,000 soldiers in an emergency. Until now, all the defense of the Baltic countries was coordinated by a single command over there in Poland. With this second command, NATO doubles its response capability in the region. The term the official used to describe the idea was mass at speed. And this matters because of a harsh geographic reality. The Baltic countries are small. They don't have space to retreat. If Russia attacks, there's no time to think. The defense has to be set up beforehand. So, the concrete slows down the enemy, buys precious minutes, and the Army Corps uses those minutes to respond. And at sea, the West launched a permanent naval mission precisely to watch over that shadow fleet that was cutting the cables. As you can see, the West saw the move coming. They realized the threat had shifted and began advancing on both fronts, on land and at sea. So that's it, everything's solved, right? It would be nice if it were, but the answer isn't that simple. This is where the real tension of this story lies. because that wall will only be ready in 2028. And even if it were ready tomorrow, there's one thing concrete can't stop. There's even a detail that changes everything. That cable cut at the bottom of the sea, the court released the crew. The drones flying over the border are always written off as navigation errors. The invasion law addresses citizen protection. Do you see what these things have in common? None of them are clear enough for someone to point a finger and say, this is an attack, let's strike back. And that's where Russia's real target lies. It's not the Baltic territory. It's something much harder to defend with concrete. It's the West's willingness to react. Think about how NATO's Article 5 works. It only matters if everyone believes in it. The day Russia cuts the cable and Europe hesitates. Launch a drone and Europe debates whether that counts or not, using the law to send troops. And half of the alliance says, calm down, we're not going to start a war over this. On that day, Article 5 becomes a worthless piece of paper, without a single tank having fired a shot. And look, this isn't a hypothesis, it just happened. At the end of May, during yet another night when Russia was launching more than 200 drones against Ukraine, one of them crossed the border and ended up falling in Romania, NATO country. It was a Gerin 2, a Russian drone loaded with explosives. It hit an apartment building in the city of Galati in the east of the country and exploded on the roof. 2 injured. And for the first time, a building where ordinary people live was hit on NATO soil. And do you know what happened next? The answer will show you how this war really works. Romania had fighter jets in the air with permission to shoot down the drone. And even so, it got through. Romanian authorities said the drone may have been diverted after being hit over there in Ukraine. Was it a deliberate attack, or was it an accident of war? Can you see the pattern here? We're asking the same questions. You can't say for sure what happened or who launched the attack. But the Russian drone hurt people on NATO soil. That's a fact. Do you know how the alliance responded? No, they didn't activate Article 5. They didn't respond militarily. They used Article 4, which basically means, let's meet and talk about it. So they summoned the Russian ambassador. They released a strong statement condemning the recklessness. And that's it. Notice what that signals to Russia. That you can hit a building on NATO soil, injure people, and the response will just be a meeting. The red line has been crossed. And nothing serious happened. Every time this happens again, the next time gets easier. What was once unthinkable becomes just another news story. It becomes the new normal. And that's how, step by step, Russia took Crimea in 2014, without ever starting a big war. This is the real war. It's not about the border, it's about doubt. The truth is that Russia doesn't need to defeat the West on the battlefield. It just needs the West to hesitate a little more with each incident, to become a little more divided, to doubt a little more whether it's worth defending a small and distant country, until one day the promise to defend the Baltics is so corroded from within that no one believes in it anymore. Not Russia, not even the Baltics themselves. And that's why that wall is going up now. Stone by stone. Concrete on concrete. The Baltics know that concrete alone won't win this war, but it sends a message that no drone can erase. Here, we take this seriously. Here, doubt won't get in. The real danger was never the tank announced at the border months in advance. It's the attack that comes disguised as an accident. The Baltics are not defending themselves from yesterday's war, the war of tanks and borders. They are shielding themselves against tomorrow's war, a war that doesn't want to take land. It actually wants to break the West's will to respond, and that no one has yet managed, to prove that it exists. The war between the United Kingdom and Russia has already begun. No, I'm not exaggerating. This is not a prediction. That's what the British intelligence chiefs themselves have been admitting in public for months. The head of MI5, The agency responsible for counter-espionage within the United Kingdom said in no uncertain terms that Russia is committed to causing chaos and destruction on British streets. The then head of MI6, the British equivalent of the CIA and the agency responsible for espionage outside the country, Richard Moore, was even more direct. Russian intelligence, in his words, went crazy. And the head of the British Armed Forces admitted in an interview that the current situation is more dangerous than I have ever seen in my career. But this war is not the war you're imagining. It doesn't have tanks crossing borders. It doesn't show up on the evening news. It's happening right under our noses, in silence. And that's exactly why it's working. That's why in April 2026, the United Kingdom did something no one thought would ever happen again. After being shelved for more than 2 decades, London pulled out the British government's most secret document. A plan that, throughout the entire Cold War, contained the exact instructions on how to turn the whole country into a war machine in a matter of weeks. Its name is the Government War Book. And the fact that it's coming back now, at this very moment, is the official admission that London had been trying to hide at any cost. The era of peace is over. According to data compiled by the risk consultancy Dragonfly, in 2025 alone, the suspected Russian hybrid attacks on European territory had already surpassed, by October, the total of everything that happened in the entire year of 2024. In September 2025, the worst episode to date occurred. Swarms of Russian drones flew over Poland. Russian military planes violated the airspace of Estonia, Romania, Denmark, and Norway during the same period. It was the moment when NATO and Russia came closest to direct confrontation since the Cold War. But since none of these incidents, taken individually, was serious enough to justify a military response, Europe ended up just protesting. Now, if that's the rule throughout all of Europe, what could be happening in the country that has most publicly opposed Putin since 2022? The most cinematic story of this new conflict begins on a Thursday, April 9th, 2026. The British Secretary of Defense, John Healey, calls an emergency press conference at Downing Street, the seat of the British government. He enters in a dark suit, a conservative tie, and begins to speak with the controlled voice of someone who knows he's about to drop a bombshell.
And I am revealing details of a recent military operation carried out by Russia. And by doing this, I do this to expose the ongoing Russian activity that threatens us in the United Kingdom, and to highlight our constant readiness to respond.
Healey says that, for more than a month, 3 Russian submarines were operating silently under the cold waters of the North Atlantic, north of the United Kingdom. One of them was an Akula, a nuclear attack submarine, one of the largest that Russia has. But according to British intelligence, the Akula was just a decoy. The real objective of the operation was the other 2 submarines. The other 2 were submarines from a Russian unit called Gudi, the main directorate for deepwater research. But the name is just a front. In practice, these submarines have a single function, as Healey stated in simple words: to map underwater infrastructure in peacetime and sabotage it in conflict. Do you know what they were mapping? Cables. Submarine cables. Those fiber optic cables that run along the ocean floor, connecting the United Kingdom to the rest of the world, and through which, believe it or not, 99% of all international communication on the planet passes. Your WhatsApp conversations, your bank transactions, your video calls, all the content on the internet, everything. If those cables are cut, the United Kingdom not only loses access to the internet, it loses access to the global financial system, military communication, and the very functioning of the modern economy. The British operation to monitor the Russians was massive. There were 450 hours of patrol aircraft flight time, thousands of nautical miles covered by a British frigate and by Norwegian allies, and 500 British military personnel, involved day and night for weeks in conditions that Healy himself described as extremely challenging and treacherous. And when the Russians finally retreated, the minister made sure to send a public message, direct without beating around the bush. Looking at the cameras, he said, "To President Putin, I say, we see you. We see your activity on our cables and pipelines, and any attempt to damage them will not be tolerated and will have serious consequences." It's the kind of sentence that 5 years ago would have sounded like a movie script. Today, it's an official statement from the British government, but the Guji submarines are just one of the weapons in this war. The other is their complete opposite in every way. It doesn't cost billions, it doesn't require military training, it doesn't need secret technology. And precisely because of that, it might be even more dangerous. In October 2025, a British judge sentenced a young man named Dylan Earle, who was 21 years old, to 17 years in prison. Earle was not a spy, had no military training, was not Russian. He was just a small-time drug dealer from central England who was dissatisfied with his life. He was looking for, in his own words to the psychiatrist, a fresh start. He found this fresh start through an anonymous channel on Telegram called Private Privet Bot. This channel, controlled by operatives linked to the Wagner Group, the famous Russian mercenary militia, invited Europeans to join the resistance against Ukraine's allies. The contract was simple, a mission paid in cryptocurrency, no face, no name, no signature. Earle agreed. He received 5,000 euros in crypto. And in March 2024, he and an accomplice set fire to a warehouse in East London. The warehouse belonged to a Ukrainian couple who shipped Starlink terminals to soldiers in Ukraine. The loss exceeded £1 million. And here's the point that changes everything. Earle was not an isolated case. He was part of an operating model. A model that Western intelligence calls the Uber of sabotage. Instead of training professional agents for years, Russia now simply outsources the dirty work. It recruits cheap criminals, pays them in crypto via Telegram, and never shows up again. If the guy gets caught, Russia denies everything. If it works, no one can prove who ordered it. According to the British Institute for Strategic Studies, more than 50 acts of sabotage in Europe between 2020 and mid-2025 follow this same pattern. There were fires in shopping centers in Warsaw, bus fires in Prague, attacks on logistics centers spread across the continent, all organized through messages on Telegram carried out by local delinquents, paid in digital currency. But this is where the story gets really scary. Because this invisible war isn't just hitting anonymous warehouses in East London, it's reaching all the way to the top of the British government. According to a recent report from the Royal United Services Institute, the most respected defense research center in the United Kingdom, properties linked to Prime Minister Keir Starmer himself have been targeted by fires suspected to have Russian connections. Russian diplomats were caught trying to enter restricted areas of the British Parliament, and Telegram channels with Russian ties were caught inciting Londoners to carry out violent attacks against mosques, an attempt, according to British intelligence, to ignite the country's social fabric from the inside out. And when the United Kingdom tried to react, tried to show strength, to show that it would no longer accept this passively, the result was humiliating. On March 26, 2026, Prime Minister Keir Starmer made a pompous announcement. He declared that from that day on, the Royal Navy was authorized to board and seize Russian oil tankers from the so-called Shadow Fleet. That network of more than 1,000 old ships without a defined flag which Russia uses to sell oil, evading Western sanctions. It was an aggressive measure. It was a response. It was a message. And do you know what happened next? Nothing. Literally nothing. In the following weeks, several Russian oil tankers quietly crossed the English Channel. One of them passed escorted by a Russian Navy frigate armed with anti-ship missiles. And do you know what the British Navy managed to send to accompany them? Just a simple auxiliary tanker ship. No weapons, no offensive capability. A reporter from the Daily Telegraph newspaper who covered the scene had to rent a 12-meter fishing boat to be able to film, because there were no British military vessels available. The British Attorney General, Lord Hamer, allegedly blocked the operation for fear of violating international maritime law. In other words, the United Kingdom authorized it publicly, but internally they stopped everything. No Russian ship was seized. No cargo was confiscated. Nothing. But the worst part wasn't even the failed operation. The worst part was the reaction. The world started to laugh. Donald Trump, in an interview, called the British fleet toys. The American Secretary of Defense, Pete Hegseth, openly mocked the great and powerful Royal Navy. And in London, British generals began to quietly admit what they had been trying to hide for years. The United Kingdom's army is now at its smallest size in the last 200 years. And the British Navy, which dominated the world's oceans for 3 centuries, today can't even seal off its own channel. And this is where the problem lies. Because the United Kingdom has spent the last 30 years cutting defense, selling military equipment as scrap, closing bases, and laying off soldiers. The British elite believed, with almost religious conviction, that peace was the final state of humanity. It was calculated. And as you may have noticed, that was a miscalculation. And here we come to that war book we mentioned at the beginning. Because it was exactly in this context, with submarines spying on cables, criminals being recruited through Telegram, the Prime Minister's homes on fire, the Navy being humiliated, that the head of the British Armed Forces, Air Marshal Richard Knighton, finally made the announcement. At a defense conference in London in April 2026, he confirmed the war book is coming back. This document was created during the First World War and was constantly updated until the fall of the Soviet Union. It has 16 chapters and describes with obsessive precision how to transform the entire United Kingdom. Cities, factories, hospitals, markets, communication systems, everything. From a peaceful civilian society to a society at war. Total. In up to 28 days. But the old Cold War version was written with only 2 threats in mind: Soviet invasion and nuclear war. But the new version, which is being written right now, has to deal with an enemy that attacks in ways no one imagined in 1989. Undersea cables being cut, power grids being hacked, addicts being recruited through Telegram, drones invading Europe's airspace, and disinformation spreading across social media like wildfire. Knighton summed up the turning point in a sentence that will be a headline for years. The British strategy is no longer defense. Now it's resilience. And resilience, according to him, requires involving the whole society, not just the army. It looks good on paper, but there's a problem. Because involving the whole society requires resources. And the United Kingdom, after 30 years, cutting defense, is in a terrible position to start now. The numbers are brutal, but to give you an idea, the British Army today has about 70,000 full-time soldiers. It's the smallest size in over 200 years. The British Navy, as we've seen, can barely patrol its own waters. And the defense budget, which is being raised in phases, will reach 3.5% of GDP by 2035, the largest increase since the Cold War. But it will only really start coming in from 2027 onwards. And here we come to the question that gives British generals chills, the question that no one in London can ignore anymore. Will there be enough time? Will there be enough time to rebuild the army that was destroyed over 3 decades before the enemy decides to launch a real attack? The United Kingdom is behind schedule. And, in the words of the head of the armed forces himself, catching up with Europe now is going to hurt. Maybe the real change isn't in the submarines nor in the laws, but in people's minds. Throughout our whole lives, we grew up believing that peace was the natural state of things and war. Well, that was the exception. Not anymore. In January of 2026, the scientists from the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists set the doomsday clock to 85 seconds to midnight. It's the closest to the end this clock has ever been in its entire history. Closer than during the Cuban Missile Crisis. Closer than it has ever been. And what the United Kingdom is doing now is not the isolated reaction of a concerned European island. It's the sign of an entire civilization realizing that the comfortable era of peace is over. What comes next, nobody knows. But the United Kingdom has finally woken up. At a barracks in Germany a few years before the invasion of Ukraine, German soldiers train in formation. But they're not holding rifles, they're holding broomsticks because there weren't enough rifles in the armory. This is the army of the richest country in Europe, and as if that wasn't enough, in February 2022, when Russia invaded Ukraine, that same Germany made its first offer of military aid to Kiev. 5,000 helmets. The mayor of the Ukrainian capital publicly called it a joke. This was the sleeping giant of Europe, but today, 4 years later, something has changed. And it's all because of a single man. The man who will regret this the most. Because Putin, when he invaded Ukraine in 2022, had a belief. He thought he knew exactly how the West and Germany would react. Now, to understand what happened, you need to know how Germany hit rock bottom. After the end of the Cold War in 1991, Germany made a decision. It decided that the era of great wars was over, and it began to dismantle its own army year after year. Between 2007 and 2017, the richest country in Europe spent only 1.2% of all the wealth it produced in a year on defense. For comparison, any NATO member country was required to spend at least 2%, and the damage started to show. In 2018, the German Air Force had 128 Eurofighter jets. Only 4 were operational. The other 124 were grounded. In early 2022, just a few days before the Russian invasion, the head of the German army, General Alphonse Meis, published a statement that made headlines around the world. He said that he was more or less empty-handed. Because for decades, Germany had bet that doing business with Russia would guarantee peace. Russian gas, billion-euro contracts, high-volume trade. But that bet ended in February 2022. And that's when the giants started to move. On February 24, 2022, Russia invaded Ukraine. 3 days later, the German Chancellor Olaf Scholz went up to Parliament and announced an emergency fund of 100 billion euros per year, right then, without discussion. He called that moment Zeitenwende. Which means a turning point in history. The word made global headlines. But what Scholz did was just the beginning, because 2 years later, a man named Friedrich Merz became chancellor, and Merz did what no German chancellor had done in 80 years. He rewrote Germany's constitution. For decades, the German constitution had a rule called Schuldenbremse, the debt brake that limited how much the government could spend, including the army. Merz convinced the parliament to take military spending out of this rule. In other words, he gave the German army unlimited money. And then, Germany started spending. Let's start with the air, because that's where the change is most shocking. The German Air Force is retiring its Tornado fighter jets, old planes from the Cold War era, and buying F-35s. The F-35 is the most advanced fighter jet in the West, invisible to most radars. But here comes the part that matters. Germany has participated in NATO's nuclear sharing since the 1960s. when it received the first bombs, American B-61s. And the mission to carry those bombs belonged to the Tornado fighter jets, which are being retired. Starting in 2030, the F-35 will take over. In other words, Germany is updating its nuclear capability with the most modern technology in the West. A country that lost a world war 80 years ago now flies the most advanced planes on the planet, ready to engage in nuclear combat if necessary. And there's more. Germany is developing, in partnership with other European countries, an unmanned fighter called Airbus Wingman, piloted by artificial intelligence. In other words, the same country that in 2018 had only 4 operational fighters will now have fighters flying without a pilot. Now let's move to the ground. Germany is about to finalize the biggest military contract in its history. The project is called Arminius. The name is a tribute to an ancient Germanic chief who defeated the Romans 2,000 years ago. The contract is worth 40 billion euros. And for that amount, Germany will buy up to 1,800 Boxer armored fighting vehicles. 1,800. Just so you have an idea, the entire Brazilian army has about 400 tanks. Germany is buying more than 4 times that amount in armored vehicles in a single contract. And the most interesting thing is who's producing them. The company is called Rheinmetall. For decades after World War II, no one in German society wanted to be seen doing business with them. Making weapons was seen as shameful. Today, Rheinmetall is worth more than Volkswagen on the stock market. Yes, you heard that right. A company that makes tanks is worth more than the largest car manufacturer in Germany. That's what happens when the mindset of an entire country changes. But a modern army needs more than just tanks and planes. It needs reach. And that's where Germany is closing an 80-year gap. Since the end of World War II, due to political choices and post-war restrictions, Germany has always depended on its allies for any attack on distant enemy territory. If it needed to hit something more than 500 kilometers away, it had to ask for permission. Now? Not anymore. Germany is buying 400 American Tomahawk missiles. Tomahawks have a range of up to 2,000 kilometers. That is, fired from German territory, they can hit targets deep inside Russia, including major cities like Moscow and St. Petersburg. It's the long-range punch that Germany never had, and it's being bought on a large scale. But here's the detail that proves this transformation is for real, and Russia already knows it. In July of 2024, 2 years after Germany began its serious rearmament, American intelligence discovered an ongoing plan, a Russian plan to assassinate Armin Papager. Armin Papager. He is the president of Rheinmetall, the man who is producing the tanks and artillery shells that are supporting Ukraine in the war. Papager was just one of several European defense leaders marked for death. American intelligence warned the German government, which increased protection. The plan was foiled. But Russia's message was clear. Anyone who manufactures weapons used against Russia becomes a target. Russia understood before the United States and the Western European countries that German rearmament is real. And it's trying to sabotage, intimidate, and kill. But the train has already left the station. Now, equipment alone doesn't make an army. An army needs people. Just so you have an idea, the German army today has 182,000 soldiers. That's a small number for a country with 80 million inhabitants. Germany's goal is to reach almost 500,000 trained military personnel in the next decade, including both active and reserve forces. The numbers are trending positively. In 2026, the applications to join the German army went up 20% compared to 2025. An entire generation of Germans who grew up never thinking about serving is now lining up to enlist. The government is also putting back on the table an idea that had been buried in 2011. Conscription. For 14 years, serving in the German army was optional. Now, if voluntary enlistment isn't enough, the country will make it mandatory. But the most symbolic move of all still wasn't that one. Look at the map of Europe. Go east, you'll find Lithuania. A small country, really small, that borders Belarus, Russia's closest ally. In Lithuania, Germany has just stationed an entire brigade, the 45th Armored Brigade, 5,000 German soldiers, by 2027, 150 kilometers from the border with Belarus. Here is the historical detail. This is the first German brigade permanently stationed outside German territory since 1945. Think about the weight of that. 80 years after World War II, German soldiers are back in Eastern Europe. But this time, not as invaders, but as defenders. It's an image that many older Europeans never imagined they would see. And no Russian expected it. The only question that remains is, with all this, will Germany be ready in time? In 2026, the German newspaper Die Welt, along with military analysts and former high-ranking officers, conducted a war simulation, a war game. The scenario was as follows. Russia invents a humanitarian crisis in Kaliningrad, a Russian territory surrounded by Lithuania and Poland. It then uses this as a pretext to send troops and invades a Lithuanian city. And do you know what the result of the simulation was? In just a few days, Russia took the city. Germany hesitated. NATO was too slow. Russia won. The German military took the results seriously. And General Carsten Breuer, the head of the German army, set an official deadline. By 2029, Germany needs to be ready for war. Because by 2029, according to German intelligence, Russia will have rebuilt the army it lost in Ukraine, and it will be able to test NATO. 4 years is all that Germany has. Remember how we started this video? German soldiers training with broomsticks. 5,000 helmets offered as military aid. The mayor of Kiev called it a joke. In 2022, that was Germany. In 2029, the German military budget will be larger than that of France and the United Kingdom combined. 7 years. Same country. Another scale. And now, remember at the beginning of the video, when we talked about Putin believing that he knew exactly how the West and Germany would react to the invasion of Ukraine? So, now you know the answer. He couldn't have been more wrong. The German beast is being unleashed, and Putin was the one who cut the chains. Putin thought that by invading Ukraine, he would weaken the West. He thought that a divided Europe with a pacifist Germany dependent on Russian gas wouldn't know how to react. He calculated that time would be on his side. He miscalculated. The man who wanted a submissive Europe. Now he will have to face a Germany armed to the teeth with 5th-generation fighter jets, thousands of tanks, missiles capable of reaching Moscow, and permanent troops on the Belarusian border. All of this he himself helped build, unintentionally. And now, it's too late to undo it. Everyone said that. NATO without the United States would be a disaster.
What surprises me about NATO is that we spend trillions of dollars on NATO. Think about trillions over several years. Many trillions of dollars. I'm not exactly happy when we help them with Ukraine. Look, Ukraine would have fallen in a day if we hadn't helped.
Analysts, journalists, even allies were skeptical. And then, Europe carried out the largest military exercise of the alliance in 2026, without a single American soldier in command, and it worked better than anything Putin can put together today. That's not an opinion. It's what happened in the Baltics in January and February of this year. There's a bet that Vladimir Putin has been making for decades. A simple bet, but one that underpins the entire Russian military strategy in Eastern Europe. The bet is as follows. The Western alliance talks fast and acts slow. At the moment an allied country was attacked, the members of the alliance would enter into debate. They would call each other. It would take days, maybe weeks, to move troops, equipment, and fuel. And in that time, in that window of paralysis, Russia would already have what it wanted. It's not a theory. That's what the Western war exercises themselves confirmed. The alliance would arrive too late. But there was an even bigger question underneath all of this. One that no one knew how to answer. Can different countries with different languages, different armies, and different interests act as a single force when the moment demands it? That question remained unanswered for decades, but in you, that bet was put to the test. And the result was not what the Kremlin expected. The alliance knew it needed to solve this problem, and the solution was something that few expected. In January of this year, the organization activated something that didn't exist 2 years ago. The Allied Reaction Force, created specifically to act quickly in any emergency. The concept is simple. Troops from various countries already designated in advance, trained together, ready to move in days, not weeks. The Steadfast Dart 2026 exercise was the biggest test of this force. To this day, 10,000 soldiers from 13 countries moving at the same time by land, sea, and air from different points in Europe to Germany. In weeks, not months, it had never worked like this before. And for the first time in a long time, the West wasn't just promising, it was proving. Without the United States in command, under German leadership. And it worked. Finally, Europe woke up. And it proved that when it decides to act, it acts. The German Minister of Defense personally attended the maneuvers. His statement was short and direct. The alliance is united and ready for action. It wasn't a speech, it was what he saw before his eyes. But the exercise delivered something that no official statement prepared the world to see. Try to guess what happened next. February 20th, 2026. Baltic Sea, -5 degrees, snowstorm, strong wind. A condition that would paralyze the operations of any less prepared force. A drone took off from the deck of the Turkish warship, Anadolu. It flew over the frozen sea. It located a target. It fired 2 precision missiles. It hit. And it landed back on the ship by itself, autonomously. It seems simple, but it's not. It was the first time in the Alliance's history that a combat drone took off from a ship, attacked a target at sea, and returned. It had never happened before. And it was Turkey that wrote this chapter, not the United States, not the United Kingdom. Turkey, with technology developed within its own country in the Baltic Sea at Russia's doorstep. And this has consequences that go beyond symbolism. A relatively cheap drone operating from a ship forces the enemy to invest in increasingly expensive defense systems, resources that Russia simply cannot divert from Ukraine at this moment. And it wasn't just the drone. In the same exercise, Spanish soldiers dived into frozen waters to prepare the coast before the landing. German fighter jets swept the airspace. Turkish and Spanish special forces descended from helicopters onto the beach under covering fire. Everything was coordinated. Everything was integrated. 13 countries operating as a single organism. That's what Putin spent decades saying would never happen. The alliance's Secretary General provided the figure this January. Russia is losing between 20 and 25,000 soldiers per month in Ukraine. Per month. Western estimates indicate that since 2022, Russia has already suffered more than 1,200,000 casualties, including dead and wounded. Russia and China keep saying that the Western alliance is dead, divided and weakened. Meanwhile, 13 countries operated together as a single army, without anyone needing to call the United States to ask for permission. Think about that for a second. While the alliance was practicing the integration of drones, aviation, and ground forces, Russia was throwing its soldiers against Ukrainian positions. at the cost of thousands of lives per week, isolated without any real military allies. Relying on missiles from North Korea and Iranian drones to try to sustain a war that, according to the Russian government itself, should have ended in days, back in 2022, Putin's gamble didn't fail by accident. It failed because the alliance changed and he didn't realize it in time. But what comes next is the part that most people ignore. Steadfast Start wasn't an exercise, it was a rehearsal. The Allied reaction force will grow, the exercises will escalate. The alliance isn't training for a scenario, it's training for all scenarios. The Europe that depended 100% on the United States for its defense is becoming a thing of the past, not because the Americans left. They are still the main pillar of the alliance, but because Europe finally decided not to depend only on them. That's what Putin feared the most, not an alliance led by the United States, an alliance that works without them. And the answer to that question that remained open for decades: can different countries act as one? The answer, at least for now, is yes. And in February 2026 in the Baltic Sea, amid a snowstorm and at -5 degrees, that alliance became real for the first time. From the concrete pyramid on the Lithuanian border to the German stealth fighter. From the spy submarine in the Atlantic to the Turkish drone over the frozen Baltic. It's all the same story. A continent that slept for 30 years believing that peace was forever. And now it's racing against the clock to protect itself. The part that nobody knows yet is whether there will be enough time. Putin bets there won't be. Europe bets there will. And the next few years will decide who was right. If this analysis made you see the world differently, leave your comment down below. Take the opportunity to share it with those who need to understand what's at stake and subscribe to the channel. This story is just beginning. See you in the next video.